I'd just like to thank you all for attending this presentation today for St John's College, Oxford, the Library and Study Centre. This project has been shortlisted for an RIBA South Award in 2020, but because of the postponement in the awards process, it's now been carried over for shortlisting this year and will be viewed in the next month or so for consideration. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by both the client and the sort of architect for the project. So we have Andrew Parker, who was the client for St John's College, and he will give a brief introduction about the college's motivation for the project. And then he will hand over to Claire Wright of Wright and Wright Architects, who will provide the virtual talk and tour. Just as a bit of background for those who sort of aren't familiar with Wright and Wright, Claire Wright is a founding partner who founded the practice in 1994 with Sandy Wright. It's a practice known for its high quality, beautifully detailed contemporary work in sensitive historic settings. The practice has 4 partners and around 20 members, all of whom contribute creatively to the work. There's been an extensive range of projects that have been delivered through the practice, which have included a number in Oxford, including a new quad for modelling college, student housing on Queen Street, plus other notable projects for National Gallery lower galleries and the rehousing of the RIBA and V&A special collections at the V&A Museum. More recently, this work has also included Lambeth Palace Library, which has recently been completed, and there's also schemes currently on the books for St John's College, Oxford, Corpus Christi, Oxford, and St Edmunds, Oxford. And I would just like to thank both Andrew and Claire for their time today, and I'd like to hand over to Andrew for a brief introduction. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody, and absolutely delighted to see so many people having a look at our project, as it were. Well, I was asked to give a context of the motivations really for St John's in engaging with this project. I actually managed to dig out a memo that I'd written in 2014 for the governing body at the time when I was bursar, and I stopped being bursar just 9 months ago now. And at that point, I kind of laid out the case for this building, and the various questions obviously were raised. But of course, the most significant one is that the proposal involved basically knocking a hole in a Grade 1 listed building and connecting a completely modern building to it. And you may imagine that Oxford College governing bodies, being what they are, that was the least of their worries. They were far more worried about many, many other things, but this business of actually attacking a wall in a Grade 1 listed building was done with no hesitation at all. Our motivations were very clear. The college had increased greatly since the last renovation of this library. Historically, the library had 2 portions, an old library and the Laudian library. And it's important to understand that in conception, neither of those was intended for student undergraduate use or even graduate use. They were exclusively for the fellows. So they were exclusively for the fellows. And they were eventually opened up to student use, but it was actually a rather unsatisfactory set of arrangements. The Victorians did a very good job in modernising the Laudian library. And then in the 1970s, Sir Howard Colvin, whom many of you will have heard of, engaged in a project to extend the library and put in a staircase at what is the southeast corner. And I think whatever you say about Colvin's scholarship, when it came to knocking around his own college, he could be fairly forthright in his approach, let's put it like that. Several rooms were turned into the new library on the ground floor, and that accommodated the expansion of books needed for that time and extra study space. What had gone in that was actually a set of rather nice fellows' rooms that overlooked what was then still referred to from time to time as the Fellows' Garden, and the entire structure of Canterbury Quad was rearranged as a consequence. So we had a number of motivations, but the main ones was that the number of students in the college had increased greatly since 1970, probably by about 2.5 times. And in particular, now graduates as well as undergraduates were expected to do quite a lot of assigned work, working on essays and so on. There were a number of graduates. So we needed a lot more reader desks and working areas. We were low compared with other libraries in other colleges, and we wanted to increase that number. It was also very difficult with the existing library to make arrangement for 24-hour access to the study space, because that meant essentially opening up what we might call the heritage areas of the library all night long, and being concerned about access, security, and all those kind of things. And most of all, anyone who tried to get through the door that Howard Colvin had created had enormous difficulty, because even on 2 legs, you normally had to turn sideways, or at least people like me did, had to turn sideways to get through this little narrow door. There was no provision for disabled access of any form whatsoever, and indeed the entire upper library, the most beautiful and significant part culturally, historically, was actually fundamentally inaccessible. We also found out, and this was a matter of concern to me as bursar, then not only were we short of space for volumes and people, we actually had our special collections dispersed around various rooms in the college. And it was particularly a concern to me to find out that some of those rooms were not exactly satisfactory for the documents that were being contained within them. So we wanted to put into this new structure some proper high quality archive space which could hold those items securely and hold them under the temperature and humidity conditions that are required. And consequently, of course, as well as the fact that the rooms were not satisfactory, the very fact that they were dispersed meant that it was a significant hassle for the library staff to make arrangements for people to look at them, and the whole thing kind of started to slightly come apart at the seams as a consequence. And in fact, the final fact was that the workplace facilities for the library staff were really not very good. So we envisaged, with Claire's assistance, a design involving a new study centre which would have a separate modern working library and study area. That could have 24-hour access. We were very happy about that. We could put in lifts into there and make disabled access. And I think a key point in the design was the discussion between, I remember this discussion between me and Claire, where we had the conception of making the datum level for the new study centre exactly the level of the Laudian Library, so that somebody in a wheelchair could get to a certain level in the new building and just go straight across in their wheelchair across a bridge structure that Claire will almost certainly describe in more detail. And so that continuity is real within the sort of if you like, the geometry of the building, as well as in the sort of conception of making the two parts of the building equivalent. And very cleverly, Claire also discovered the use of a passage that we call the Atranto Passage, supposedly named after the Castle Otranto book, but it was a hidden passage nobody knew about. It was actually a bookstore, and a very ingenious and clever design of that turned it into a very gentle ramp through which a wheelchair user can move. We've actually put a very lovely frieze, glass frieze in there now, and that makes a very interesting entrance to the library for someone who comes straight through Canterbury Quad and then turns left at the far end just before they go into the garden. So we've got a number of important other facilities, not the least of which is that we now have an area at the very north end of the new study centre, which is connected but also can be securely disconnected from the rest of the library. Into that we can now, when we're back in full business again, we'll be able to bring in school groups. We can bring out specific documents and treasures from the library, show them in the way that they would be actually handled by scholars. And to that critical age group of, let's say, 13 to 16, 17-year-olds, we can show them what it would be like to work with this precious material. And so that connectivity and accessibility to these rather special documents that we have would, could be facilitated through that route. So we actually fulfilled all of those things. That was my shopping list in 2014. The last one that we put was that it should be a very green building. And I think we've been extremely successful with that. We've got some numbers in now from a year-long monitoring exercise. We took our courage into our hands, dug up the Great Lawn of the college, put in ground source heat pumps in there. And as far as I can tell, and all the reports are, that's now working very beautifully and efficiently and keeping the ultimate energy costs of this building very, very close to carbon zero. It's been a bit undermined by the requirements for fresh air circulation as a consequence of COVID. So the numbers are not quite balancing, but I'm pretty confident when we get back into normal operation of the building with automated controls, then it will be spot on. So absolutely delighted to work with Claire. It's been a real pleasure. And I think it's time for me to stop and hand over to Claire now.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrew. So I'll share the screen. My conditions, as you can see, I'm in the office, and this is our office meeting room where we've got a very good screen. So not quite as salubrious as many of you, and certainly not as salubrious as the site on which our building was built. So we chose this title to describe some of the project because of the constraints, some of which Andrew has mentioned. And there are elements here in this extremely significant historic site that constrained where we could put any sort of openings. And at the same time, as you can see, it is set next to the most wonderful, luscious garden. And in that, we have been very privileged. And what we have found as architects, and I expect many of you experience this too, having constraints is often a real spur for creativity. So, oops, I think I've gone too far. What you see on the left there is Canterbury Quadrangle, which Andrew was talking about. And the head of planning at Historic England described this as the most important Baroque building in the United Kingdom. So no pressure. And on the right, there is an example from the special collection, which Andrew mentioned. And this is a medieval manuscript, which is looking at time, astronomy, and cosmology. And it gives you some sense of the importance of this collection, which is of international significance. Now, when you look, what you see architecturally here is that you're looking through from the front quad, and you see that you have this experience of being contained, and then in Canterbury Quadrangle, there's expansion, but the light at the end and that contraction and darkness again, which architecturally are very beautiful. And I'm sure many of you have been to the gardens at St John, but if not, post-COVID, I recommend that you go and have a look because it is lovely. Sorry, just getting used to technology. So here's the plan, which Andrew was talking about. So we're looking down that axis into the garden, And what happens here, so this was paid for and influenced by Archbishop Laud, who was Archbishop of Canterbury. There was Old Library here, which Andrew mentioned, and then Laud completed the whole ward. And you were expected to move axially. This is for people who only move at right angles. And that applied inside as well. So here you see on plan, you came up the stair here, and this was Old Library. And then on axis, you have these lovely windows, and Laud then built his library here on axis with that. And in the doorway into it, it says above, God is the greatest geometer of all. So it is all about the geometry. And Laud's coat of arms are in the window here, and the original donors for the Old Library are memorialized in the stained glass window here. And we were interested in this theme of windows that you see in colleges, where the significant spaces, the hall, the chapel, and the library, are signaled by the windows and the beautiful light that can be created through them, often using stained glass. Sorry, I'll get the hang of it. Now, the other thing about this site, that's Canterbury Quadrangle here, was that it looks out onto the groves, which is this area. And that is enclosed by a 17th century wall, which went all the way around here. And there were 2 points about this wall. One was that people had built contemporary buildings in relation to it. So here, you can see a building by Arab Associates that you see behind the wall from the groves. And then Richard McCormack built right into the wall here. And then in other cases, this is an earlier manifestation of an opening that was cut into it. At the same time, if you see this line in red, there was an odd phenomena that the wall didn't go straight up from Canterbury Quad. It bulged, and this wall was paid for by a Mr. Sprott, who was one of the Enlightenment group. For some reason in the 17th century, he gifted this wall to the college, which was fortuitous for us. I'll come back to that in a moment. This shows the development of the college. So historically, you had the library, the president's lodgings, the hall and the chapel in this area here. But the college has grown in the 19th and 20th century to the north, all the way up here, very successfully, culminating in the Kendra Building by McCormack, James and Pritchard. And this building was so successful that the students could live here and really be quite autonomous, so that they could eat and sleep and study and go out into Oxford. But that isn't part of the collegiate way of being. And so there were some concerns that they were becoming so separate from the activities at the heart of the college. Oops, yeah. So coming back to Canterbury Quadrangle, and Andrew sort of touched on this, the original brief was to extend the library. And there had been schemes in the past too. There was quite a well-developed scheme to put it underground. And there was another proposal to include it with the Kendra Building in that development. And the fellows weren't happy. They didn't feel that resolved it. So those ideas didn't go ahead. And they felt that if a new library was built, this would become a mausoleum. So we came to look at it, and we came to this point in here, which is here, which is spatially at the climatic point of the development, where you move from the building and you get that wonderful view of the garden. And when we got there, we noticed that there were these doors, and when which were set into the wall. And so we opened the door, and as Andrew mentioned, we found this passageway here, the Atranto Passage. And that was the solution, part of the solution to extending the library. So looking at the geometry, then in 1603, this library was built. And then in 1633, when it was extended, you were to move at right angles. as Andrew said, Colvin came in on the diagonal and he gutted this part and put in a rather ugly staircase in the 1970s. And he converted the lower floor of these very handsome rooms, which didn't really work in terms of scale. And so what we proposed instead was that you go into the Atranto Passage and go up. And in this corner, major changes had been made. So we could make changes there and put in a staircase, which meant that at first floor level, you could then enter the library on axes. And as Andrew alluded, the old library here has the very special collection from Lord in it, but that could stay there and be made secure. So then if we go back to Mr. Sprott and the bulge, which he left, we found that you could go up the Atranto Passage and put a staircase in here. And then there was the space between Mr. Sprott's wall and the garden, into which a study centre could neatly fit. And that could serve two purposes. It could be a study centre, but it could also link all of the student accommodation. So the students could come from here and actually just pass through it and come out into Canterbury Quadrangle rather than going in a very convoluted way around it. But as I said, there are blank walls. So as Sprott's wall, it's grade 1 listed. So of course you couldn't build into that. And then the study centre was onto the President's Garden, which of course is private. And so we didn't want to have fenestrations there, which would allow you to see into the garden. So we had the idea of building the walls so that it stepped out, so that this route would have a place within it, where people might sit and wait for their friends, and that this might become a modern interpretation of the library window and be a special feature within the building. So phase 1 was looking at the Atranto Passage and the staircase here. So you see here that this is the view that you get looking down through that doorway. So it's rather like Alice disappearing down a rabbit hole, because it's really not evident within Canterbury Quadrangle. But those of you who know about colleges will know that there are often these routes through that only those who live in a part of the college really know. So you see behind that, there's a reception area. We pull away from Sprott's wall, so there's a little courtyard. There's the foyer that then leads to a portico, so that the entrance at the other end is of completely different scale. And the study areas, the reading rooms, happen on 3 floors against the wall. Now, when we stepped it out into the garden, we also wanted to make sure that people from the garden didn't wander into view. And so we introduced a pond at the bottom of the wall. But coming back to the Atranto Passage, this is the view from that space, looking back. So as I said, much of the fabric here had been taken away, but there still was this piece of 17th century partition, which we kept. And then we tied that into the new staircase, which you see here, which is built in brass and oak and steel. And you see that we introduced a new stone wall here. So you see here the detailing of the oak and finishing it off. So the staircase goes up from here, and it sits in a roll of brass at the bottom and a roll of brass at the top, so it doesn't actually touch anything. And then Andrew's point, one of the most important elements was that the original Laudian library would not become a mausoleum. So you step off the staircase here, and so that we felt that anyone coming into the library would look down and would almost touch the Laudian library, whether they went to study there or, as Andrew said, they crossed the bridge to go over into the new building. Now this, as he says, this set the datum. It was that level that set the datum for the floor of the new study centre. So this is where we broke through. So there were 2 windows, one here and one here. And you see there how they then connect through to that staircase and to the Atranto Passage. So you see in elevation, the new building, the bridge Andrew talked about, which is clad in lead and glass. and then the stone-faced building that sits here, and the scale of it with Canterbury Quadrangle. Now there is a strange phenomenon, which is that there is only one point in the garden, which is quite far up here, from which you can actually see both buildings. Otherwise, you cannot see the building in relation, the new building in relation to Canterbury Quadrangle. And I did say to Andrew at one point that we might be able to design the building so you couldn't see it. And he said, surely I'm not spending all this money for an invisible building. But what we've tried to do is to have it as a presence, but that it's quite subtle. So you see there the Atranto Passage, the reception, foyer, portico. And this is within the space, within the foyer. So having had this idea of this window, then what we wanted was for there to be a play of light, which was ever changing with the seasons and with the weather and with the time of day. And that was done through setting it into the pond where you get reflections of the water. But also we worked with the artist Susanna Herron on developing the design of this stone wall here, which was carved inside and out. But when you move through, you do get views, but they're dynamic. So they're constantly changing, and they're you can't see into the garden. And there you see that's a photograph of the outside. So one of the basis of this was the carving on Canterbury Quadrangle, and you see there the soffit, which is at the entrance that we went into at the Atranto Passage, and that we worked with Susanna. I mean, although this is, you know, it's her work, but this is the photograph of the layering of the planes taken from the garden side. And when we were thinking about this, Sandy and I went off to Andalusia to look at stone and water and light, and to learn as much as we could about creating these phenomena. And we worked very closely with Susanna. So Sandy chose all the stone for the building, and we set up samples. Andrew, of course, was part of this too, came along so that we experimented with the light. And this is what it looks like when it's very difficult to capture, but when it's playing across the wall, which is exactly what we were aiming for. And this shows how Susanna did it digitally rather than people manually cutting the stone, and then it was cut with lasers. So you see it there externally on a very still day. It's actually best when there's a bit of a breeze and it ruffles the water. And then at the far end where the portico is, it changes so that the students have some inkling of it, but not so much that they can get in and have a paddle. And this is the portico at the other end. So the entrance at this end, we wanted to do quite the opposite. We wanted it to be highly significant and very apparent, and that it would be obvious that this was a key social space in the building. And you see there the historic walls. This one was not listed where we cut through, but that's Sprott's wall there. And this is to the side of that where you see Sprott's wall, and we planted the two of the windows that we removed onto the wall. And you see how we can bring light in here. There was a rumor going amongst the students that they were going to get a library with no windows. But in fact, you get a lot of light through here, and it's elevated there so that that's a plenum, which introduces fresh air at this end of the building, and it's down at the other end too. And there you see the entrance. So opposite this is the Art Associate building at the bottom of the hill, so that the 4 and 5 stories there then transpire to be the same height as this building. So we felt that it had to stand up to the Arab and the other contemporary work, and that it could be signified with this window, so that you couldn't possibly mistake it for residential accommodation. And we also played with the idea of symmetry and asymmetry. So the door at the bottom is on axis and it's door sized. But this mullion sits on that axis, and there is a plan in Canterbury Quadrangle. At one end there's a statue of the king, and at the other end of the queen. And there is an idea that at some point the college can represent itself here. That's obviously quite tricky piece to make. And we wanted the building to be asymmetric, and for this window to take you around the corner and into the gardens as well. So in terms of the materials and the construction, which is largely down to Sandy and many others in the team, you see here the relationship within the portico of the new materials, which is quite a limited palette, and its relationship with the old. So, as Andrew said, this building is net zero carbon. The inception, the special collection, is set into the ground in the basement, and that makes it very stable. Although we have backup mechanical control, and the fabric itself does it primarily passively. There we have this plenum, which links to chimneys, which can heat and cool the building, although there's also underfloor heating. That's the foyer that you saw. You will notice that the mullions are very heavy. The glazing is all triple glazed, so that and so you get these quite heavy mullions, and it's also got a film on it. So we work very hard on the modelling to maximise the lighting in the building, but at the same time avoid any sort of overheating. We quite like the relationship of having you go up a story or half a story or down to these two separate reading rooms, and then this one on the top. So you see the lower reading room sits behind Sprott's wall and is top lit, and the books are in the deep part of the plan. The middle floor overlooks that area, and then the top floor looks out into the groves with cross ventilation. There's the ground source under the Great Lawn, 55 boreholes, and there are photovoltaics as well. So this is the lower reading room. So you see this is set against Sprott's wall. And the light, it's beautiful dappled light because we're quite close to trees, but Sprott's wall kept their roots on their side of the fence. And then the books in the deep part of the plan. Then looking at the other way, you look into the little courtyard where we put away from Sprott's wall at the south end. This is the mezzanine. What we found is that people like to study in different ways. So some people want to study by themselves, tucked away, whilst others want to be with their friends. And we tried hard to be consistent in the detailing throughout the building. And there you see the upper floor where we have books in the centre of the plan. You can sort of see over them, but it's a sort of in between where you can tuck yourself behind the bookcases as well and look out into the park. And then the end room, which Andrew talked about. So this is a seminar room in the big window, set into the big window, which has got fantastic state-of-the-art. You can connect up all over the world, and it has very good sound and light and that. So what we tried to do here was create a window where you actually step right out of the room. So the window goes right up through 4 meters here. And these panes slide right back. So you actually can be, there is a glass screen to stop you falling, but you can be actually outside. And you see something of the section there. And this is what it looks like then from the groves. And one of the architectural features is that the windows, from that entrance asymmetry, the windows always go around the corners there and there in 2 blocks with a central block go back. You see here its relationship to Sprott's wall, the new building to Sprott's wall, and then from the groves. So where this section is pulled back, and you will have seen in the section that we step it in order to lessen the impact externally, and also because we like it to have a sort of 3-dimensional quality. And then that's the south courtyard. This is the librarian's office, and that's it from the inside, looking towards the bridge, which Andrew mentioned, and then from the President's Garden. So there are no great buildings without great clients, and Andrew was very involved throughout and absolutely committed to try to help us build the best building that we could and to make the right decisions. And I think we are unbelievably fortunate in having a client who takes that approach, as I'm sure every single one of you would vouch. And now the team are starting work on phase 3, which is looking at the older part of the college and putting things back, more or less. So this is a CGI which shows where Colvin took this floor out and put in a rather ugly staircase. So the floor is being put back, and we're dealing with disabled access. So this will be a place where the college will reinstate it, where people will be able to come and study, but they'll also be able to display their special collection. So everybody can go and see it, but through appointment. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Claire, and thank you, Andrew, as well. I don't know if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask. You can pop them into chat and I'll relay them. I know I've got one thing to ask. Obviously, sort of rationalising all the levels and the other sort of site factors must have been quite challenging, you know, as you say, with sort of Sprott's Wall and various other listed structures to contend with. Were there any sort of areas that you felt were almost sort of problematic, or did you manage to get sort of the local conservation officers on board fairly quickly?
They did come on board. They did come on board. Yes, Historic England came to see, and when we explained it to them, they said, "Well, I think that's just obvious. It's an obvious solution." So I think that's very reassuring, isn't it? When they say it's obvious. So we were very pleased about that. They were actually extremely supportive all the way through. Considering it was Canterbury Quadrangle, I suppose we were very, very lucky that in that corner room in the 70s, they put in a spiral staircase and made such radical alterations that we could make all those junctions. That was really fortuitous. Had the original interior been there, I don't think that would have been possible. It really did feel as though, you know, in the 17th century, they'd been planned for us. You know, we sometimes get this feeling, I don't know if any of you have this feeling, sometimes you just feel that we didn't really do it. We just sort of brushed away the sand and it was always there. Do you know what I mean? I mean, the Atranto Passage was there, the bulge was there, you know. So it was reacting to those, and the level thing. I mean, Andrew was right that we decided very early on, because in some ways, you know, we could have tucked the building right down, but we felt that floor had to go through in order to make sure that the original library stays important. And I'm sure, I mean, you know, it's got all the protection up at the moment. I'm sure some students will definitely prefer working in the old space, won't they, to the new. Though the new seems to be very popular.
Great, thank you. We've had a question in asking from start to finish, how long did the project take from sort of concept to completion? Andrew mentioned a sort of a note from 2014, so it's obviously, you know, been quite sort of long in the process, sort of drawing the scheme out.
How long did it take, Andrew? I'm not.
Would say about 10 years altogether. I think you came along 2011, 12 with some sketches and walking around. And that report from 2014 was me actually asking for permission to apply for planning permission.
Okay.
Permission from governing body to apply for planning permission for the design that was being created at that time. So we were, and that took a while to get to that stage. So it was a slow process. I was also very interested in what Claire said about the 17th century preparing for us, in that one of the absolutely delightful features was that at the point at which the Laudian Library joins on to the foyer now, there's a double door which you look through all the way down the Laudian Library in the Claire slides. We did not know there was an entrance there. In fact, it had been blocked up, we don't quite know when. And as we found a drawing from that time which suggested it was there, but some people dismissed that just as a pure fantasy of something that might have been. But once they actually started chipping away, we found that the masonry was correct for an exit at that point in the library, which had been completely forgotten.
Actually, that's right, Andrew, and even more than that, because there was a drawing with an entrance there, so we did some exploratory opening up and didn't find the entrance, and so we wrestled with how to make that connection into the library, whether it should be a contemporary piece of architecture, which is the way we wanted to do it, Andrew and we did. Historic England people didn't, but then when we came to form the opening, we found this, but it was very odd because what had happened was there had been an opening that had been blocked in with stone, but it must have been given to a stone apprentice, stonemason apprentice or something as an exercise, because they had hidden it. Like, it was as though they said, can you build in stone here and completely conceal it? And then they plastered on top. So it had clearly just been an exercise given to somebody to show how skilled they were. But of course, it meant we couldn't find it because it was very well done. So that was quite a weird thing, actually. And then that meant we reverted to the original design. Yes.
Thank you. Another couple of questions have come in. One's asking, were other options explored in response to the need for connecting Kendra and the wider master plan?
Well, actually, that not really, because what happened was that we came up with the idea of the scheme, and then when we presented it to the college, the fellows said, oh, this solves this problem of connecting up to the old and the new, otherwise you go all this way around. So we didn't actually set out to solve that problem. We did it inadvertently, but it was a plus. And then once they said it, then it became an element that we had to think about, of people who are just passing through rather than coming there to study.
And presumably, sort of, I know, there's possibly not that many students in at the moment. Presumably it has, sort of functioned extremely well in, as you say, sort of making that connection between the various sort of parts of the college grounds as a focal point.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, particularly in winter. I mean, for someone to be able to go through a sheltered area from one side of the college to another, it just had immediate appeal, and everybody was cheering.
Thank you. Another question that's come through is Claire mentioning going to Spain to look at stone, and was there an historic reference in the college for stone from that region, or was it Susanna Herring's preferred medium?
No, that wasn't why we went. It was because we got into this idea of the water and the light reflecting off the water, and so we thought of Seville and the Alhambra, and Sandy and I had never been there, and so one January I surprised him with the idea that we would go there, and it was if you haven't been, then I would strongly recommend it. It's fantastic, and we were just kind of going about, but we were very specifically looking. To be honest, one of the engineers said that it wouldn't work. The caustics wouldn't work, and that the light wasn't strong enough in the UK and so on. So we were really kind of just trying to look at it, because I don't think it just seemed to us that was the best place to go, to kind of try and see what other people had done and how effective it was. And I think at the time, actually, some people in the college were concerned that we were effectively presenting a blank facade. So we came back with all these slides and videos of light moving in stone with water, which we presented with Andrew to the fellows, and that convinced them that it was a good thing to do.
You mentioned obviously sort of phase 3 now, installing that floor, which will be sort of great for, as you say, sort of sorting out that sort of axial sort of plan. So where are you in regards to that sort of process at the moment? If you're at CGI, is it I'm guessing it's still relatively early stages at the moment, but obviously it's quite exciting to see that.
They just started on site,
Right.
working with Beard, who many of you know, I expect. So what that scheme will comprise is there's going to be quite a lot of measures to make the buildings far more energy efficient, because the library actually, there's no insulation under the floor and not much in the roof. And then the Victorians changed it, so there's a bit of, so lots of extra bookcases got added, so some of those get thinned out. And then we're also putting back the rooms that were all knocked through. The proportion wasn't really very good. I mean, it did create space, but they were very beautiful rooms in themselves. And so Sandy, working with Andrew, looked very hard at, you know, where paneling being ripped out and that sort of thing to reinstate those rooms, because they were very lovely. Only there'll be some loos and stuff as well. So so I think, and it would be good for the college to have those rooms back in that part of the college, because it'll bring people back into there, because otherwise it gets very quiet after a certain time.
That's also a very important point for us, that if we have teaching rooms, tutors rooms in that part of the college, there'll always be a regular movement of people to and from that Canterbury Quad. And again, this kind of breaks down the appearance of Canterbury Quad as being just a place where visitors go. We wanted it to really be sustained as a living building as well.
And a big part, and then the glazing. So they've done a lot of work. Andrews was committed from the beginning to this being a zero carbon building, and whatever was involved in that. So they've worked up, the team has worked up some windows which have got special glass from Pilkington, so it's got really high energy efficiency, but it's quite light, so they're able to use sections, astragals that are, you know, appropriately sized, but then make these very efficient, energy efficient windows in the historic part too.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. This one's aimed at Andrew, questioning whether the library is accessible to the general public. Catherine Higgins has been tempted by Claire's slides and would love to visit, and how does one arrange this? I have to say, as an RIBA Oxfordshire person, I think I may be having an email exchange to sort out an actual physical building tour when it's safe to do so. So Catherine, watch out for that. But yeah, Andrew, sorry.
It is a working library, so there are constraints. In terms of actual library tours, that's certainly something that I think the college would like to show it off from time to time in a sort of controlled way. But we have, if you wanted to come along and consult some documents that the library happens to have, then that's almost an easier ask than saying, can I just have a walk through? So a strategically organised request might easily be fulfilled, and no doubt we will have at some point, I hope, some of Claire's notes and designs to for people to come and consult the originals of when we finally pull all this project together. So I mean, there are various opportunities, but no, it is in brief, it is not open to the general public in the way that some other libraries might be.
Actually, the other thing is we pulled together a book which has got those photographs and the drawings and a lot of the text, and explains things in it, which the office has. If anybody would like a copy, they could email us.
Thank you very much. Couple of last questions, because we are running slightly over. That's my fault for not chairing it very well. But was longevity, design life, a key requirement for the project? And did this have an impact on the material selection and construction methods? Also, has the building been designed to provide opportunities for adaptation in the future, ability to sort of subdivide space and change use of spaces for the future?
It has. I mean, the longevity, I mean, I think that was just implicit. We always, Andrew and I always kind of thought that, because if you look, and there are buildings that date back to 1633, you know, you kind of think maybe this one will last that long too. So I think that's that was Andrew's approach, and that's one of the joys as an architect of the client, that approach, because you take care over it. And yes, we did think about adapting it. The college was really concerned about that. We had quite a long meeting about that because there's a lot of thought about what libraries could become in the future. And so the building is designed so that you can take all the books out of the top floor and turn it, well, I mean, COVID might change all that, but environmentally, in terms of ventilation, each of the reading room floors could be separated and could be used in other ways without books and readers, if that was how studying evolved.
Absolutely. Now, there was a very intense debate about the future of the book and various things that you might think academics would get excited about, and it's a real debate because we don't really know how people will study and work in the future. There may be a lot more peer-to-peer learning and group learning, we think, that rather than individual learning. And at the moment, the layout of the library is trying to balance between those two, but is probably still towards the more traditional one person at a desk kind of learning. But we have that flexibility, and we're very pleased that we've got it so that people can rearrange things.
Okay, thank you. I'll just take this last question that's coming from Christopher England-Rendon, and it touches on something, Andrew, you mentioned at the start. He says, great presentation. Over that year, what range of post-occupancy evaluation did you conduct, and what measurements differed? Was a surprise from the original design?
There's one standout thing, which I'm afraid it was Claire was absolutely convinced this was the right thing to do. So we put in a set of seats, day beds, which ran along the top floor gallery room. And everybody of our age thought these were fantastic. We thought there would be nothing better than to sit up there with a book, take your shoes off and lie on one of these beds and just sit. The next generation just think these are despicable. They demanded that they were ripped out and proper desks were put in so that people could sit at a proper desk and work. And so there is a seriousness coming back into scholarship, which I'm looking forward to seeing the outcome of. But we were given quite a severe telling off for having something as frivolous as this in this space. I don't know if you've got anything else to add, Claire, but that's the one.
That was it.
That's great. We had one statement from Nick B. He said, fabulous building. Thank you for a great tour and looking forward to visiting it in the near future. And as I said, yes, we will try and sort that out. So I would just like to thank everybody. Oh, yes, sorry, Andrew.
One last thing. We always make an exception for tours by architects. They're a very special group, and we've had a sequence of parties at different times coming to look at the architecture of the college, particularly from Brooks and the Beehive building and so on. So that's always possible, and you just write to the bursar, and the answer should be always yes, if we can.
Thank you very much. That's very generous. Thank you. So yes, I would just like to thank Andrew and obviously Claire as well for a fascinating presentation, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to provide the presentation and answer the questions. I'd also like to thank Emma at the RIBA South Office for coordinating this, and yeah, just wish everybody a great day. And thank you very much for attending, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.